Hey everyone, my name is Rebecca Roberson, and I am a Communications and Program Manager with the Elections Group. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Elections Group partners with state and local election officials to implement new programs and improve processes for voters and stakeholders alike. We provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for state and local jurisdictions. And our team is made up of election experts and former election officials from across the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss Leading in Elections Debrief. Today, we are excited to share a new resource with you called the Election Debrief Handbook. We've placed a link to this in the chat. This handbook is designed to help local election officials debrief their teams after an election. It will help you and your team reflect on challenges and successes from the last election cycle and identify opportunities to improve processes within your office. Before we begin, I would also like to draw your attention to other great debrief resources. The Center for Civic Design just released their own debrief guide called the Post-Election Debrief Toolkit. And additionally, the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence has published their own guide for debriefing elections. Links to both of these resources are also in the chat. All right, I am excited to introduce our panelists today. We have Danny, Mike, and Jess from our team here joining us. We will go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and I will start with Danny.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the introduction, Rebecca. I'm Danny Davenport. I am an election expert here at the Elections Group. I will talk more about myself in this resource in a second, but I will say this team, me, Jess, and Mike, were three of the folks who are responsible for a lot of the content for this debrief guide. I also want to shout out Andrew from our team who did really incredible design work. We're just super excited to talk about it today and share this resource with you.
It looks like we have Jess next.
So, hey everyone, very excited to be talking about this debrief guide today. My name is Jasenia Eliza. Everyone calls me Jess. I've had the pleasure of working with the Elections Group for a little over a year now. And prior to this, I was with the civic tech nonprofit Democracy Works as their Director of Government Initiatives.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have Mike.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike. I have been with the Elections Group for 2 years now, actually a little over 2 years, and I was a former election official in Colorado and Pennsylvania prior to that. So really excited to be having this conversation this morning.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. I guess we'll go ahead and get right into the panel. We have a lot to go over and a lot of time to fill, so this is great. So we're going to break down the resource section by section. So right now, if y'all are following along at home, we're in the introduction. So my first question is, just tell us a little bit about the resource that you've built.
Sure. So real briefly, the resource we're talking about today, as you mentioned, Rebecca, is called the Election Debrief Handbook. For those of you following along, you can access that on our website at electionsgroup.com, or there should be a link for the resource in the chat. And basically, at a high level, this resource is a guide to help election officials lead their teams through debriefing the most recent election. In this case, for us today, that's the 2024 general election.
Perfect. Thank you. So why did TAG decide to build this resource?
Sure. So I think we wanted to build this resource and put it out now because it's so timely. That we're recording this on November 22nd, 2024. We just got through the 2024 general election in a lot of states. I know it's not quite done. You're still dealing with certification, canvass, and audits. But in the weeks immediately sort of following an election, that's the best time to debrief because the information is fresh on your mind. So we wanted to release this resource so that local election officials can start debriefing now, and or come back from the holidays prepared to make any needed updates and changes to processes in their office.
Perfect. Thank you. So what is an election debrief?
Sure. So we're going to spend a lot of time on this today. But again, at like a really high level, a post-election debrief is a structured conversation. It's a reflection and feedback session for you, the local election official, and your team to discuss the successes and challenges you faced during the most recent election. Throughout your debrief process, your team's primary goal is to learn from the last election so that you can improve processes for upcoming elections.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. So it looks like we're going to talk about scheduling now. So the first question about scheduling is, why is it important to hold a post-election debrief within 3 to 4 weeks of the election, specifically this election?
Yeah, so it's key to try and conduct your post-election debrief as soon as you can, because as Danny mentioned, you want the details of the election to be fresh on everyone's mind. Obviously, memory fades over time. So aiming for that 3 to 4 weeks ensures your team can more accurately recall successes. What things went well? What do we want to make sure we repeat in the future? What were some of our challenges, and what are some areas for improvement? I think the other thing is it allows you to document and maybe even implement any actionable insights before your next election. You know, during your debrief, you may note that you need a new training for staff. You need to clarify or adapt a procedure. Maybe you identify a gap in resources or staffing. So the sooner you have that information, the better.
Okay, so what factors might delay the timing of a post-election debrief, and when should election officials aim to hold it if an immediate debriefing is not possible?
So Danny also kind of alluded to this. As we know, there's a lot going on immediately following an election. In some cases, it might be difficult to hold that debrief within that 3 to 4 week window because you're still running other processes and procedures. You might be doing your certification process. There might be an audit going on. You've got a recount. There could be any number of post-election activities. So I think in this instance, you should aim to hold that debrief again as soon as possible, but we would recommend within 1 to 2 weeks of completing all your major post-election activities. And I'll add that a step that you may want to take if you find that you aren't going to be able to hold that debrief for, let's say, 2 months, is to have your staff set aside some time to write some notes for themselves about how they feel the election went. And you might provide some general prompts like, overall, how would you describe the election? What are some things you feel went well? What are some things you would have done differently? Or is there an area where you could have used more specific training? And it doesn't need to be anything lengthy or complicated or something they submit to anyone. But then when it's time to actually hold that debrief, they can pull up their notes, and that'll help refresh their memory of the events of the election.
I love the idea of having the notes. I've definitely been in situations where the debrief has come several months after the election, and it's hard to recall everything that happened. So that's a great tip. So my next question has to do with time management. Why is it recommended to plan at least 4 hours for a post-election debrief? That was the recommendation you guys set in the guide. And what benefits does a full workday offer?
All right, I'm happy to take that one. And +1 to that previous comment. Yes, there's so much going on during an election that you can lose what you did the day before. There's just so many conversations, so many transactions with voters and vendors. So yeah, that note taking is super helpful leading up to a debrief. So the whole concept of the 4-hour day, I think first it's really important. Having a 4-hour block of time really allows for uninterrupted focus, and I think that's critical in something as complicated as discussing everything that went on during the election. So there's just going to be a lot to cover. You don't want staff thinking about other meetings they're coming from, other work that they have to get done that particular day. And when you think about how complex elections are, you really want to give staff that additional time to iterate on topics, think critically, and that can be hard to do in shorter blocks of time, especially when they're sandwiched between other activities. I know some of us here have attended, for example, two-day workshops. That just creates a different atmosphere, a different opportunity to create just a deeper work product than attending a shorter 1-hour meeting, for example. So also, if your workplace permits it, it really does demonstrate, and it demonstrates value and buy-in for the whole staff and from leadership. If you're able to say, this is what we're going to do today. We are going to perhaps get permission to close the office for the day or for the half day. We're going to let the phones go to voicemail. It lets staff know that this is not just another meeting. This is not just another stand-up. This is something that's really critical to our success in the future as a high-performing team. Finally, something that I really subscribe to. I think humans are really bad at multitasking. And so when we try to jump from one task to another, say, okay, we're going to have our morning meeting, we're going to go to our work, then we're going to hold a debriefing, then we're going to do something else. There's this idea called attention residue. And it's the idea that when you move from one task quickly to another task, you're still kind of focusing on that previous task. So give your staff the chance to do that deep dive, to spend some time on that one topic.
Thank you so much. So how can a shorter debrief that's maybe 1 or 2 hours, if that's all the time you have to give, still be effective in addressing key issues or challenges?
Yeah, sure. A shorter debrief can absolutely still be effective. Here are a few things you might want to consider. First, really make the most of your time. So eliminate interruptions. Again, go find a conference room, commit to letting the phones go to voicemail. This is what you're doing with that hour or that 2 hours. Try not to sandwich the meeting between two other meetings. Again, that concept of attention residue, just try to let this meeting be its own standalone event. You can also introduce some concepts ahead of time, give staff a little homework perhaps in advance, let them do some prep work so that they come ready to share their answers. Another thing you can do is use the hour to really do a deep dive into a singular issue or event that was really impactful during the election that you want to discuss. So maybe, unfortunately, there was a major misstep or some sort of high impact event. So instead of tackling broad topics, maybe you could just hone in on that one particular event that was really important for staff, had a really high impact, and say, okay, what went well, what went wrong? We have another election coming up. What are we going to do differently this time? So it's just another way to make really good use of that, maybe that hour that you could commit. And finally, I would say, don't beat yourself up. There are plenty of opportunities. There's going to be another election coming, but this one debrief event is not your only opportunity to discuss things. If you're holding a 1-hour session, that's fantastic. Don't feel bad that you didn't commit a whole day to it.
Perfect, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about longer and shorter debriefs. So what criteria should be used to prioritize topics during a shorter debrief? And how can this focus improve future election processes?
Sure. For me, I think that ultimately this needs to be a management decision, but I would again consider high impact events, consider maybe what I call like the low hanging fruit, the things that maybe you can tackle in a reasonable time within the next couple weeks. That way it kind of gives staff an opportunity to see the results of the debrief and actually make some of those changes right there in the upcoming months.
Perfect, thank you so much. So for folks who are following along at home, we are now in the section called Facilitating the Debrief. So my first question about that section is, how should election officials prepare for their debrief?
Sure. I can take this one. The first point, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of what Mike just said. So like the first thing you sort of want to think about when you're preparing for the debrief is making sure you have those topics prioritized. I'm going to co-sign and second everything Mike said about sort of thinking about the low-hanging fruit, identifying like what the biggest challenges were. There's also not like one right or wrong way to figure out what to prioritize. You got to think about sort of the context of your office. Maybe that's a decision just the local election official should make. Maybe the executive team, depending on how big your team is, maybe it's like you and the deputy. Maybe you want to get feedback from your team to see what their challenges are before you go to the debrief. And you can do that either through a survey. If you have a big office, you can ask people to submit topics, by email, or if you have a small office, you could just informally walk around and say like, hey, what do you want to make sure you talk about? But I think the key thing is to have your topics prioritized ahead of the debrief. And then you also want to make sure you've gathered all of the materials that you're going to need. And what I mean by that is there might be specific forms, manuals, laws, or regulations that you want to discuss during the debrief. It's better to outline that ahead of time, know what resources you want to talk about, and then have copies of them ready. So make sure your team can also look at and talk about those resources with you as you go through them. For example, let's say you have a comms team or your whole team participates in comms if you're in a mid-sized or small office. Maybe you want to have a press release that you did from this election cycle available and be able to sort of through the debrief talk about the press release and say, what did we do really well here? What could we improve upon? And have an actual just sort of physical artifact for people to look at and think about. As far as sort of other things to think about for facilitation, you definitely want to make sure you have a designated note taker, maybe even more than one designated note taker, depending on how you structure your debrief. You should definitely set the expectation ahead of time that the notes need to be thorough. like Mike said, this is sort of part of that stage setting where you just make sure everybody understands this is not just another meeting, but like a really big important part of the continuous improvement process. So make sure everybody knows that there's going to be thorough notes taken. And then consider providing your team with questions ahead of time. If you know that you're going to cover a lot of topics or that it's going to be a long day, you can, one of the benefits of our guide is we have a big set of questions that are available. You can take that and provide that to your team and give them copies to think about. Finally, you want to think carefully about who's going to facilitate the debrief. It might be you, the lead local election official, or perhaps you think your team would be more candid without their boss in the room. And maybe you want to ask someone else from either within your team or someone else in local government who can come and act as a surrogate to lead the debrief for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So what are some tips for conducting the debrief?
Sure. So if you are following along in the guide, I will point you to a specific page. Our tips are sort of highlighted starting at page 7 of the guide. And we have 8 major tips, and I'm just going to really quickly run through those at a high level. But some of the big tips we have are make sure you have a clear agenda so that everybody can be on the same page and feel organized as you go through the conversation. Create a safe and comfortable environment. And what that means, that sort of goes back to the point Mike made, which is just make sure everybody knows that this is going to be a candid conversation, that people are going to be respected for their opinions, because this is ultimately an opportunity to figure out what your real challenges were. Start on a positive note. So you definitely want people to know that like this is not just a session for people to air grievances. That might be a useful thing to do, but that's not what a debrief is. The debrief is not just about airing grievances. It's about thinking about challenges that are actionable, where you can come up to solutions and doing that in a positive way, coming from the perspective of like, here's how we did a great job. Like we were successful, and here's how we're gonna do an even better and more efficient job in future elections. Use visuals and data where helpful. I think this is a really important one. If you know that there is data or information that's going to be instructive or helpful or illustrative for your team, gather that ahead of time. So for example, if like one thing you want to debrief on is like how long it took people to get through queues at a polling location, or how quickly or efficiently you perform different processes, voter registration, and you have objective data on that, maybe collect it and put it into a chart ahead of time so that your team can sort of like in a really clear way engage with that. Other tips, cover the essentials and cultivate continuous feedback. That's a theme you're going to see a lot in the guide. But basically, make sure you hit whatever the biggest pain points for your team were. Also hit your biggest successes. Again, positive environment. Make sure that you focus on both of those things. And remind your team that the debrief is not a one and done. This is not like the single time that you're going to try to improve. This is the beginning of what will hopefully be an ongoing conversation with your team forever about how to improve processes. And this is just a place to get started. Help your team stay focused. And this goes back to that idea of, well, I forget the term you had, Mike, but the sort of what was it?
Attention residue.
Attention residue. Yeah. So we're all human beings. We all know how hard it can be to sit in a room and focus on one topic or even a few topics for hours on end. Give people breaks. When you finish talking about, like poll workers, give everybody a few minutes to stand up, grab a snack, like just talk, like have a conversation for a few minutes and bring people, like back and then refocus on the next topic. Another big important one, document the debrief. Like I said before, have thorough notes. Make sure that you know what kind of information you want to record from folks in the room, especially anything where they offer a solution or the first step towards a solution. And then finally, adjust the format as needed. So you'll see in our guide, we have a lot of specific tips to get you started, specific structural ideas for how to lead the debrief. And you should also, for sure, look at those resources that those other great organizations have shared, Center for Civic Design and the Alliance for Election Excellence. But, if it turns out being the case that you need to go off script, that you see there's a better way to get value than just asking the questions in order, be willing to do that. If several of your team members all really want to spend a lot of time on one topic, at least be open to that. Consider whether there's value to get in that and be willing to adjust the agenda. Yeah, and I believe that if you do those 8 things, you're going to have a very successful debrief.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So it looks like the next section, we are moving right along for folks who are following along at home. Now we are discussing debriefing by topic. So my first question is, what topics does this guide cover? And I think this is going to be Danny, so I'll kick it to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump right back in. Again, I'm going to give you guys a list, but you can also look at this in the guide. So we tried to make sure, the first half of our guide sort of walks you through like the process of setting up your debrief, planning for your debrief, facilitating your debrief. But because we're the elections group and we're a group of election experts, a lot of former election officials, we also wanted to make sure we included specific election administration sort of debrief topics with a really thorough set of questions and spaces to include action items. So we started, we have, I think, 6 topics in the guide. They are ballot proofing, management and audits, registration and voting, communications, security, poll workers, and then management and leadership.
Those are great topics. So how did y'all decide on these topics?
Sure. So we drew from the first we drew from the expertise and knowledge of our really incredible team. So a lot of us are former state and local election officials. All of us have experience working in the election landscape. So we started from sort of thinking about like what our experience informs us are the biggest challenges that offices often face with election administration, particularly, the things that you can debrief on right after an election cycle has ended. But I do want to flag that this is by no means an exhaustive list. And our guide actually, we considered that when we designed this. Our guide provides several blank template pages so that you can add additional topics and questions. So we really want this to be a guide that allows you to be flexible and tailor this to the needs of your team.
Great, thank you. Why is it important to allow team members to suggest debrief topics ahead of time?
Yeah, sure. I can give Danny a break. Yeah, so I think this one to me is kind of fairly intuitive. Just like during the live debrief, you want to hear from your staff. And as the manager, you might not be, hopefully you have that very good global holistic perspective of the election, but you may not be aware of every single phone call, every transaction that staff dealt with. So, give staff that opportunity to share out what they think might be important to discuss during the debrief. And along with that, I mean, remember your staff have pretty much lived in the office for the past couple weeks, past couple months. They're probably incredibly passionate, have a lot of buy-in into the work that they just did. So, make sure that it's not just a top-down event. Give them the opportunity to help build it.
So how can creating your own list of debrief topics based on observations during the election contribute to a more effective debrief?
Yeah, sure. I guess from a manager's perspective, it's kind of the flip side of that coin. You do have that more global, holistic perspective. So, bring that to the debrief topics and make sure that you're covering what's critical. I think just to me, what's really important is don't just come with a blank slate saying, okay, what do you want to discuss today? Come with some structure and have that be combined, staff input as well as management perspective.
Great. And what should you do if you're unable to cover every topic within the time that's allocated for the debrief?
I can jump in. Or Mike, would you want to?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be really brief on this one. We talked about this a little bit earlier. If you're unable to cover every topic, like, just be willing to restructure. Just be really deliberate. Like, know the amount of time you're going to have available. Start with a pretty strong idea of like, I want to dedicate, X amount of time to this topic, Y to this topic. But then, be willing to make some accommodations based on where you're sort of getting the most interesting conversation, where your team has been able to identify action items or respond to challenges with solutions. And I think that's basically the best way to sort of approach it.
Great. Mike, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, that's perfect.
Awesome. And so how can emphasizing the debrief as the beginning of an ongoing process of continuous improvement help manage team expectations?
I can happy to jump back in there. I think it's important kind of thing similar to things that we've alluded to already. Make sure that staff understand that the debrief is not the only opportunity to discuss things. This is part of our commitment to continuous improvement in the department. So I'll keep that one short and sweet.
No, I liked it. Does anybody have anything that they want to add to that? All in agreement?
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So if you're following along, we are going to talk about participants now. So my first question about participation is, how does the size and structure of your team influence the approach to participant inclusion in the post-election debrief? And whoever wants it, speak up.
I'm happy, unless somebody else wants to jump in, I'm happy to grab this one. Yeah, so just think about sort of the size of your team and the structure of your team. And if you're from a large office, you're more likely to have team members with specialized roles. You might have specifically a comms team. And in that case, you have specific people with specific roles. Maybe you want to debrief that small group rather than all of your employees. And part of the reason for that is simply like the relevance of the material. If you know that the folks in your office who are going to be writing a debrief are all members of the comms team, then maybe that's the right cohort to talk to rather than bringing the rest of your team members into that conversation. In smaller offices in general, it's more likely that your team members are going to work across multiple office functions, that they might be handling, like a more sort of diverse set of responsibilities within the office. In that case, that's a situation where maybe you want to conduct the full debrief with your entire team present. And of course, this isn't an either or. There are like sort of hybrid ways to do this, again, just based on the time you have, the structure of your team. Maybe you hold, the beginning of the debrief with your whole team, talk about topics that are going to be relevant to everyone across the organization. And then perhaps you have breakout groups, and you give sort of trusted leaders within the smaller teams an opportunity to break out and talk about more specific topics that affect a smaller subset of your group. So like mail ballot processing for your mail ballot team, if you're fortunate enough to have an office with a designated mail ballot team, comms, all of those sort of specialty topics. So yeah, just figure out what makes the most sense for your office in those situations.
To follow up on that, what are the benefits of breaking a larger team's debrief into smaller focused sessions while still maintaining broader discussions?
I think it's exactly that. It's in the question. It's the idea of the focused sessions, right? Like there are certainly topics you want your whole team to be involved in and talk about, especially if they impact everyone in the office. But in general, you want to make sure that everyone feels like the debrief is relevant and productive for them. So again, if you know that your comm shop is always going to handle all of your comms work and that's less relevant to the rest of your team, you're just going to get a benefit from making sure that people feel like their time is being used wisely during the debrief.
All right, so we are moving right along to selecting a facilitator. So how might using an external facilitator or third party for a post-election debrief encourage more honest and candid feedback from team members?
I'll take this one. So if you have an internal leader guiding the session, it might be difficult for a team to feel comfortable discussing topics, especially if we're talking about more sensitive ones. For example, if it's something about management or leadership, or maybe some major operational challenges. So an external facilitator or a third party can help create a more neutral environment. They may be seen as someone who is unbiased, and that can encourage your team to be more open and candid than they would be with an internal leader leading the session.
What are the advantages of gathering anonymous feedback before the debrief if an external facilitator is not available?
Yeah, so practically, I think we understand that it is going to be likely challenging to secure an external facilitator. So something you might want to consider for these more sensitive topics, especially, is putting a survey together of key questions and asking your staff to complete it before the session. And I want to add that this may not only provide a safe space for the team to share concerns, but it can also even ensure broader participation, especially if you've got people on your team who might be a little less vocal in group settings. This gives them a way to contribute their insights that they wouldn't have had otherwise, potentially. And you'll want to ensure that that feedback you're gathering, it is anonymous, and that you let your team know that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so moving right along, we're going to talk a little bit about materials and format now. So my first question is, what are the benefits of using visual tools like whiteboards or sticky notes during a post-election debrief, and how do they help capture the ideas of your team in real time?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take that. And first, I'll just point that the guide, the debriefing guide that was put out by the Center for Civic Design, really gives some excellent ideas for brainstorming activities, icebreaker activities, ways to get conversation going. So just a nod to that. I think that's definitely another great tool in your arsenal to take a look at. So to answer the question, part of what Jess was saying definitely resonates. Some of these activities are a great way to have people who are maybe not as vocal participate. If they're writing things on a sticky note or using different tools that aren't just raising your hand, it's just a great way to get people talking. So one thing that's great about using whiteboards, Post-it notes, it does allow multiple people to participate at the same time without talking over each other. If you think of if you're going to do a timed 1-minute brainstorm, if everyone is just calling out their ideas, you kind of still have to take turns. People eventually are going to people are going to get kind of talked over. Using a whiteboard or Post-it notes just allows everybody to get their ideas out there. It also lets the same idea appear more than once, which creates emphasis. I think if you're in a talking brainstorm and you hear somebody say an idea, you kind of let that idea, you let that idea go. But when you're using Post-it notes or whiteboards, you could write little +1s on the whiteboard, or multiple people could have the same sticky note, or the same concept written on a sticky note, or themes. It just kind of helps generate emphasis. I think it's also just really impactful to see everything up there, especially, again, for staff who are maybe quieter, staff who are maybe more processors. It's a little easier to iterate and comment when you have a visual in front of you. It also makes it a lot easier to come back to topics, I think. Sometimes in a group setting, if you want to go back to a topic, it can kind of feel a little bit like a non sequitur. But when it's actually up there on a dry erase board or up there on a Post-it note, it's a little easier to literally point to it and say, can we go back to that topic right there?
I love that. And one of the benefits to using the Post-its or the sticky note situation is you can keep it and add it to your notes and memorialize it for later. So yeah, you
Yes.
can save it. Awesome. Well, next question is, how can using applications like Miro, Slido, or Google Suite improve the process of collecting and analyzing feedback during a debrief?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one as well. Yeah, right now there is just a whole slew of fantastic tools and applications online out there for you to check out and experiment with. Some of the great things with these tools, they allow, just right off the bat, they allow things like remote attendance. They allow unique ways to give visual feedback. We talked before about anonymity. They maybe give ways for people to give their feedback without attaching their name to things. These are also great tools for accessibility. Some fun tools like Slido, which is kind of a quiz survey format tool. It can allow you to get feedback in real time from your staff. So if you want to throw out a question and see, how many people on your team, agree or disagree, or how they would want to prioritize topics, it's just kind of a fun interactive way to get feedback. For those of you who haven't used Miro, Miro boards, it's kind of like a giant electronic whiteboard. You can throw sticky notes and organize things. So it's just a great visual tool. Again, it allows remote attendance. And all these tools really can take the burden off the note taker. Like I think Rebecca just said, as far as memorializing things, this way you're actually recording everything in real time. You don't have that same nervousness about having a note taker record every single thing that was being said right there in real time. It kind of gives them much better tools for note taking and organizing and coming back to it later.
Thank you so much. All right, so we are now going to be talking about follow-up. So how can we ensure that the feedback we've gathered from the debrief leads to tangible improvements rather than just remaining observations?
So I think this is a really great question, and one that I want to emphasize the importance of, because I think sometimes we make the time to collect the information from our teams, but then things come up, priorities change, and then we don't move on that valuable insight we've received, or we don't move on it in ways that we should have. So after this debrief, you're going to want to review the notes, feedback, and you're going to want to come up with a plan. And this is what we refer to as actioning the debrief in the guide. You want this plan to include the identified challenges that you faced in the election. You want to clearly name the areas where improvements or changes are needed. This helps really focus the plan. And it could include processes that were identified as problematic. So maybe there were tasks that weren't completed as expected, for example. And so this may mean you are updating training materials, creating new materials, building or updating forms, creating or updating standard operating procedures. So after you've identified your challenges in this action plan, you're going to detail what your implementation solutions are going to look like. And for this, you want to really outline specific steps for each action item. You want to detail what resources may be needed and who's responsible for each task. And for some tasks, you may need to have more than one individual working on something. It's going to be really important to ensure you have someone set as the lead so they ensure that all the work continues to move forward. As part of those detailed implementation solutions, you also want to have deadlines for implementation. And you want that to be very clear to ensure everything keeps moving forward. For those bigger tasks, you might have a task where it's going to take 2 to 3 months. It's not something that's just going to get fixed, within a week or two. So for those, you'll likely want to establish some sort of milestone to help you track your progress. You want to create follow-up and feedback mechanisms as well. You want to include ways to provide feedback on the action plan itself. You may also want to include regular check-ins or status updates to assess progress. And this can help when you are refining the strategy or you need to adjust actions. You may find that you've outlined some steps, but along the way, you need to pivot. Maybe something's changed with your staffing, with your resources or your equipment. So it's important to keep looking at that plan and thinking through, okay, are there items that we need to change? Now, once you've put together this action plan, you're going to want to share it with your team. Schedule a time to review it together. Make sure it gets shared with them at least a day, if not 2, before the actual meeting, so they have a chance to go through it and they can jot down what their questions or notes might be. And then hold that time to talk about it. And this approach really allows it to be a little bit more interactive. Folks can ask the questions, they can offer feedback. You'll want to clearly explain the purpose of the action plan, and you want to try and highlight the relationships between what actions are going to be taken and how they go back to what was discussed during your debrief, those things that were identified as the things you might need to continue doing or fix or change. And then you might find you need to make some edits to this plan. And of course, that may happen. Let your team know you're going to be making some changes based off of this review conversation and when they can expect the updated plan so they can get started taking some action.
Thank you so much. All right, so we are nearing the end of the debrief guide if you're following along. So wrapping up, so what else would each of you like for the folks who are joining us today to know about this guide? Do you have any key takeaways, worksheets, resources, anything that folks at home should know?
Sure, I can, I'll jump in on this first. So I do have one part of the guide I want to draw everybody's attention to. If you look at the appendix of the guide, you will see there's a few sort of different entries there, but the one I want to draw your attention to is the resource table that we included in there. So this resource table, we included a ton of really great resources. A lot of them are from the elections group, but we also have several from other industry leaders, including, CCD, Center for Civic Design, U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, and several others. We sort of categorize these resources by topic, at least with the sort of 6 topics that we led with within the guide. And the resources we chose to highlight are all things that hopefully will help you with your after action. So these are great things to reference once you've sort of figured out what your challenges are, what you want to improve on. They might just help you sort of get those up to speed really quickly. Things like election management calendars, like tips on election security from several different reputable organizations. We have plenty of posters and templates, comms information, literally like everything you can think of. It's just a great library of resources to look at. So please, please, please do that. And then other, final remark I'll make is I just want to say, like, This was really fun. I think we really enjoyed making this debrief guide. I also think it's something that all of us who worked on it really care about and believe in. So I want to say first, thank you to the team that worked on this. And second, just that like I think once you start to go through this, you as election officials will probably also feel just as enthusiastic and excited about it as we did.
Great, that was great. I mean, I'll just share the one thing that I would point out with the guide is, we did a lot of work kind of curating topics for you and questions for you. But and I know Danny said this earlier in the earlier in the webinar, but just to emphasize, I mean, you can use this as a debrief in a box, but also it's, go ahead, use it as a template, change topics, change questions, just kind of feel free to pick and choose and see what works for you.
There isn't much left for me to say because both Danny and Mike covered probably the two things I would have said, that this is a resource that we poured a lot of thought and energy into, and that it can serve as a really great foundation or jumping off point for your post-election debriefs, but you don't have to follow it to the letter. Along with the resources, we also have suggested action items for each particular topic. So you might find you're holding this debrief and you've got some things you're looking at, you're not sure how to put it together. What is this leading to? What is a particular action I can take from this? I think if you look at some of the action items in some of those sections, that can help guide you forward on how you might move a process forward or change a procedure or something to that effect.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I think that this resource is great. It makes debriefing very easy, breaks everything down by topic. Folks can simply just download this resource and have a great debrief with their team. So wonderful work, as always. So thank you so much to everybody at home who joined us today. And thank you to the entire team who joined us today. This was a great discussion. All of the resources that we mentioned in today's chat have been placed into the chat. And as always, our inbox is open. If you have any additional questions, please email us at support@electionsgroup.com. And thank you so much again for joining us for our first post-election webinar of the season. We will see you next time.